Hello and welcome to episode 2 of the Physiology of Endurance Running podcast. I'm your host, Dan Nash, PhD researcher in exercise physiology and 2:15 marathon runner. So welcome to this second episode. I first just want to thank everybody who listened in and tuned in to the inaugural episode, and actually thank you so much for such kind feedback. It's proved to be really popular. I've had over 600 downloads, which I'm really happy with. And thank you for making me want to record another one. That first one not just flopping completely. So it's proved popular, we're back for another episode. So today we're going to talk about, or I'm going to talk about, the second threshold. Okay, and this is what people commonly refer to when they're talking about their threshold, at roughly pace you could sustain for about an hour. But what I'm going to do today is to define it specifically. What is the second threshold? I'm going to talk about actually why is it important for performance, what physiologically determines the second threshold, and that becomes quite important when the next part of the podcast, which will be how should we train it? How should we train to improve our second threshold? And then the second part of this episode, I'm going to talk about how can we measure the second threshold, but actually outside of a lab environment. And here I'm going to talk about using critical speed as a really useful tool that we can employ if we don't have access to lactate testing or laboratory testing. And actually how can we use critical speed to establish our second threshold and use it for training prescription, and how we can use it how we can apply the critical speed model to help optimize our training. And then I'll finish up with wrapping up with actually who are the experts in the area, specifically looking at critical speed in this case, and who should you go follow, and actually who should you go and look up if you want to find out more about this topic. So hopefully that's interesting for you all. Again, I've chosen this topic because I think it's an area where people do get confused, and it's a really confusing area. There's lots of terms that are thrown around which sometimes mean the same thing or referring to the same physiological phenomenon, but other very similar phrases are referring to something completely different. So hopefully I can help clarify that. But again, using critical speed is something that can be accessed by everybody, which is actually, I want this to be a very much applied podcast. I want there to be things that you can actually take away and use from a podcast, much like the nutrition episode that we covered last week. And I thought this would be a good topic where actually you can get something useful out of it and not just interesting theoretical knowledge. So I hope that sounds interesting. We'll start then actually, what is the second threshold? Okay, and how I'm going to explain this is I'm going to talk through what happens to our metabolism and our physiology at 3 different exercise intensities. So first, we're going to go on a nice, easy long run, 60 seconds, 90 seconds, a mile, slower than marathon pace, so really comfy. And at this intensity, it's very easy to match the metabolic demands of running at that intensity, that pace, through our metabolism. So actually, we can break down a mixture of fats and carbohydrates within our mitochondria to produce energy almost entirely aerobically to maintain that intensity, that pace. And if we did some lactate measurements, they would be really stable over time. So if we took it at 15 minutes into this long, easy run we're doing, it might be about 1.5 millimole, pretty much the same as if we were sitting on the sofa resting. And if we took it at 30 minutes, it's probably still going to be about 1 millimole. Again, at 60 minutes, 65, 75 minutes, 90 minutes, etc. And that would be reflected in things such as your heart rate. So actually, your heart rate would you start your run, heart rate will ramp straight up to, let's say it's 130 beats per minute, and it's not going to drift too much over time. You're going to very quickly match the energy expenditure you need through aerobic metabolism, and heart rate is going to stay nice and stable. So it might drift a couple of beats, but actually if we're staying hydrated, we're taking on fluids and maybe a bit of energy during our run, and heart rate should stay very stable over time. And other things such as your oxygen consumption, which are reflected quite well by your heart rate, they will be nice and stable. And even just our perceptual effort is going to be pretty stable over time. We're going to be, maybe it's a 3 out of 10 effort. By the end of a run, maybe it's a 4 out of 10, but there's not too much drift going on. Now we're going to do a marathon pace tempo. Okay, we're going to do an hour at marathon pace, and let's imagine we're a 2.5 hour marathon runner. So now we can meet the metabolic demands of running at intensity effectively, but now we need to rely a little bit more on burning glycogen as a fuel source, and there's going to be an increased amount of glycolytic or anaerobic energy contributions. And what you'll see is actually that lactate will drift up a little bit at the start of the run. So let's say we took it at 10 minutes. Imagine let's say we took one before we started. It's about 1.5 millimole. We run for 10 minutes. It's about 2.5 millimole. But by 20 minutes, it's 3 millimole. 30 minutes, it's only 3.1, and then it's going to stay at about 3, but at 3 and to 3.5 for the rest of the 1 hour tempo, 1 hour run at marathon pace. So things are elevated, lactate elevated above baseline, but actually we're in a sort of steady state or a quasi-steady state. So there may be a small amount of drift, but actually things aren't shooting out of control. And again, that'll be reflected in our lactate, in our heart rate. It's gonna climb a little bit for the first 10 minutes, but then it's going to sort of reach a bit of a plateau. The same for our oxygen consumption. If we were measuring the pH of our blood, again, it would be very similar. So we're sort of reaching a steady state, a metabolic steady state during this 1 hour. So now, a completely separate day, we're going to do a 10K race. And we're a fast runner. We're going to run it in 29 minutes. It's going to be a personal best. But it's going to be a very unusual 10K, but we're going to take lactate every 5 minutes. And here, there's going to be no observable steady state. Lactate is going to be, even after 5 minutes, it's going to be 4 millimoles. And actually, in 10 minutes, it's going to be 5. 15 minutes, it's going to be 6. And what you're going to see is lactate is just going to drift linearly up all the way until we end the race. And the same will be for heart rate, for oxygen consumption. Things are just going to keep drifting up until actually we get to VO2 max and exhaustion at the end of a race if we've paced it evenly. So there's definitely no observable steady state in this 10K race. Now, between these three conditions, there are 2 observable thresholds. Now, between the easy long run, somewhere between that easy long run pace and that marathon pace, there's going to be a first threshold. And commonly this is referred to as the lactate threshold, because lactate is normally how we establish this threshold. But in terms of a lactate threshold, this is the highest intensity that we can maintain without lactate increasing above baseline levels. But we can look at ventilatory measures as well. You might have heard of ventilatory threshold 1, which can also be used to estimate this intensity. But that's basically where your first threshold lies, and it's you can probably sustain this intensity for around 3 hours. But I think it's just important that actually if we're going to spend most of the episode talking about our second threshold, it's worth us not getting it confused with the first threshold, which is the first increase in lactate above baseline levels. So the second threshold is what is going to fall somewhere between that marathon pace intensity and our 10K race intensity, okay? And the second threshold is the highest intensity where we can maintain a metabolic steady state. So the highest speed that we can run at, or intensity that we can run at, where lactate is going to remain quite stable. Again, quite stable. It's a quasi-steady state, really, because there is going to be some drift over time, but it's going to be quite a very small drift compared to if we're operating above this second threshold. And again, heart rate is going to be elevated, but pretty stable. There's only going to be drift by a few beats per minute over the course of a run at the second threshold. So that's really the definition of the second threshold, I'd say, is the classic definition is the highest intensity that you could maintain, that you can run at, while still maintaining a steady state. And this is what typically people think of as their threshold. But there are lots of different names for this second threshold. I'm using the second threshold because it's sort of an encompassing term, but this is the same as the maximal lactate steady state, or if we take incremental exercise tests, people talk about the lactate turn point, which is where lactate starts going up starts increasing, where lactate goes from increasing very slowly to a sudden increase in lactate with just a small increase in exercise intensity. So the lactate turn point is another estimate of this maximal lactate, of this maximal metabolic steady state. Now another tool we can use is the critical speed, if we're running, of critical power concept, if we're cycling and we're measuring power output. But that's another way that we can try to establish this maximal intensity where a metabolic steady state can be maintained. But they're all, as I said, there's lots of different terms, and that's because there's lots of different ways of measuring it. As I said, like we could look at oxygen consumption, we could look at lactate, we could look at performance data, we could look at pH, and that's why there are so many different and often confusing phrases that are all trying to establish the same sort of phenomenon of the metabolic steady state. And we'll talk a bit more about critical speed later, but actually throughout this episode, I'm going to try and refer to it as the second threshold. So why is the second threshold important? So in the context of the marathon, especially if you're a faster marathon runner, hopefully it's quite apparent that actually the second threshold sets the ceiling of what is sustainable. Okay, because actually if you start operating above the second threshold, then your things are quite going to quickly deteriorate. So oxygen consumption is going to keep going up, lactate is going to keep going up, and actually we can only do a finite amount of work above the second threshold. And actually that finite amount of work can be thought of as a battery. So we can either deplete it really quickly, in the case of a 1500 meter race, for example, or we can eke it out more slowly over the course of a 10K race. But actually the amount of work you can do above the second threshold is quite fixed, but it's limited. Okay, so actually we can't sustain it for very long, which is why actually when we're doing racing a marathon, we can't go faster than our second threshold unless we want to blow up quite early on and fade quite quickly, because it's just not sustainable for a long period of time. And if we look at elite marathon runners, so the guys who are running like low 2 hours, they're sustaining about 95-96% of their critical speeds or their second threshold. So they're operating really close to it, but just below. Now, part of the fact is because they're only running for 2 hours compared to, say, a 3-hour marathon runner. But at the same time, they're also exceptionally well conditioned to be able to A, have a really high second threshold, and B, be able to operate very close to it for a long period of time in the marathon, for example. So it really is going to set the performance limit, if you like, for distances and competitions that are happening slower than the second threshold. But also about shorter events, like the 1500 meters of a 5K, the 10K, because these are happening at a speed that is above the second threshold. So for these shorter events, actually the second threshold still seems to correlate really well with performance. And that's because, going back to this concept of a battery of work that you can do above the second threshold being limited, if we can improve our second threshold, then that's going to decrease our reliance on using that battery. So we need to use less glycolysis, anaerobic energy contributions coming from that battery. And it also means that we've got more space for our VO2 to drift up to meet our max, if that makes sense. So actually, exhaustion tends to happen when we get to VO2 max. And if we can delay that by having a bigger buffer between our critical speeds and our VO2 max, then that's going to improve our performance. So just on that last point there, just to clarify, I think actually a smaller gap between your critical speeds or your second threshold and your VO2 max tends to be associated with people who are fitter, because actually more of their energy that is available to them is available from sustainable sources. Because actually if we can sustain the second threshold for a very long period of time, well, about an hour, give or take, then actually if we can transfer that into 1500 meter running, 5K running, then more of the energy that we're using to run at that pace is coming from sustainable sources, which is going to mean that there's less of a buildup of lactate. It's going to less of a drift in oxygen consumption, or in other words, or we can run at faster speeds for the same drift, if that makes sense. And what you'll see is actually that both middle distance runners and marathon runners are these days going to have a very high second threshold. And that's because it's very important for performance. There are plenty of examples of people like the Ingebrigtsens out there who are doing very high volumes of training, and lots of stuff at their threshold. But actually that's pretty common, I think, in any athlete now, and actually that you need to have if you're specializing in middle distance events, you need to have a very high aerobic capacity, a very high second threshold, as well as a big anaerobic capacity to go with it. Okay, so hopefully I've convinced you that it's important for performance. I'm going to put some material in the show notes that you might want to read up on if you're particularly interested in any of these topics or want to find out about a bit more. But now I'm going to move on to actually what determines the second threshold. So physiologically, what's happening that means that actually once we exceed this intensity, we can no longer maintain a steady state. And actually, we don't really 100% know. Right? That's the honest answer. There's lots of stuff out there to describe the phenomenon, and that actually it definitely seems to exist. But there is a window of an intensity where actually if we exceed that zone, then we can no longer maintain a steady state, but we don't 100% know why. But there are a couple of things we do know. The first one is that the percentage of slow twitch muscle fibers we have, so slow twitch fibers being the ones that we recruit first in exercise, then better aerobic metabolism, and they're very fatigue resistant, but can't produce massive amounts of force. These slow twitch type 1 muscle fibers, the percentage we have correlates really quite nicely with an individual's second threshold or their critical speed in this case. Okay. And that highlights, I think, firstly, that the machinery of the muscle fibers is really important, and actually having a muscle fiber that's got very high aerobic capacity seems to be important for having a high critical speed. Now, the second thing that also correlates really well is what level of capillarization these slow twitch muscles fibers have. So within a muscle, we have a muscle is made up of lots of individual muscle fibers. And each one of these muscle fibers is surrounded by and in contact with capillaries. So capillaries are the very small blood vessels which easily allow the transfer of nutrients, of gases, to and from tissues. So in the example of a muscle fiber, the very small, these capillaries, these very small blood vessels are rammed up against these muscle fibers, and they're going to allow oxygen, for example, and glucose to transport from the blood into the muscle fiber, but also allow things like lactate and carbon dioxide to diffuse out of the muscle fiber and back into the blood. So it's where we can see a transfer of nutrients, of gases, of waste products into and out of the muscle. And actually, if a muscle fiber, if the amount of contacts that a capillary has with a muscle fiber, so allowing a greater flux of nutrients, gases, whatever, this correlates really, again, nicely with someone's critical speed. So there seems to be two factors involved here. It's actually the machinery of a muscle fiber, so how big its aerobic capacity is, its mitochondrial content, and its ability to produce energy from aerobic metabolism at very fast rates, combined with really good connectivity, a really efficient system for transferring nutrients, blood gases, waste products into and out of the muscle. So a really good delivery system. Now there's probably lots of other things going on as well, but I think they're the two things that we know for definite. I expect things such as lactate transporters, enzymes such as pyruvate dehydrogenase are also really important parts of the equation, but actually that's more speculative. I want to ground this podcast in what we actually do know, and I think actually the main takeaway messages seem to be that a really aerobically conditioned muscle fiber partnered with a really good transport system, exchange system in terms of good capillarization seems to be a big determinant of how how high our second threshold is. So I think those two bits of knowledge tell us maybe a little bit about how we should train to improve our second threshold. But again, I would say that this isn't an area that is conclusive by any means, and there's certainly no established training intensity, one particular training intensity that is going to improve our second threshold, and that's all we need to do. I think it's probably going to be a bit of a mix, understandably, because actually if we know that the second threshold is so important for performance, we don't see elite athletes going out there and just training at one intensity all the time. It's going to be a bit of a mix of different intensities and different durations of training, which are probably going to come together to optimize the training adaptations that lead to an improvement in second threshold. But I still think there are some things that we can take away from the scientific knowledge and that are important for bearing in mind how we should maybe develop the capacities we need to improve our second threshold. And the first, I think, key message is that the second threshold is very much an aerobic phenomenon. Okay, it's to do with actually the rate of which we can produce energy aerobically and without relying too much on that anaerobic glycolytic contributions that come with fast twitch fibers recruitment. So that means that one of our goals should definitely be to develop our slow twitch fibers and improve their capacities to burn fuel aerobically. So that basically means lots of mitochondria, which are also very efficient with high enzyme content, are very good, and they have a very fast rate of producing energy aerobically. Now, we also want to probably increase the aerobic capacities of our fast twitch muscle fibers. So actually, if we can make our fast twitch fibers more like slow twitch muscle fibers, then that is going to probably translate into an improved second threshold. So that's sort of targeting the capacity of our muscles to generate energy aerobically. Now, the second part of the equation, the capillarization of our muscle fibers. Now, that's something where we do have a bit more evidence to suggest that actually to increase our rates of angiogenesis, which is to say creating new new blood vessels and more capillarization of the muscles, then that seems to be more arise more from moderate intensity, long duration training rather than super high intensity training and interval training, etc. So actually, most of the a lot of the benefits we're getting from that long duration volume training is probably through the capillarization of our muscle fibers. And again, if we look at what the elites do, actually at the elite level, in some capacity, everybody's doing a high volume of training, whether that be purely running or for a mixture of cross training. Everybody at the elite level is doing a high volume of training, which again suggests that this is probably a mechanism through which we are seeing increased capillarization of the muscles, which is going to allow for an increased flux of gases, nutrients to go in and out of the muscles really quickly and efficiently, and so improve our second threshold. Now, how do we actually improve the capacities of our muscle fibers? As I mentioned earlier, now that's yet less clear, but it's probably going to be some mix of duration and intensity. Intensity definitely is important for developing for mitochondrial biogenesis, so in creating more mitochondria, which are the powerhouses of the cells, and for making them more efficient. But actually, we can't say that it's specifically work above the threshold or work below the threshold. And I think you could go back to the rule of specificity, and that threshold training is going to improve your threshold. Now, I think there's many good arguments for that, but I don't think we can conclusively say that that is the most effective, or at least the only way that we can get mitochondrial gains. And actually, there are papers out there that show mitochondrial biogenesis with doing the sort of super intense HIIT protocols with or even sprint interval training with 30 seconds flat out running with 4 or 5 minutes recovery in between. So I think intensity is definitely part of the equation there, but I think there's still a place for some threshold running as well. Now, I think what begs the question here is actually if we don't really know if threshold training is good for improving our threshold, then actually why do we even need to do threshold training at all? Or actually, why do we even need to know our threshold? And I think they're both very valid questions, but I think for me, if we know our threshold, where it is roughly, then it really helps in training prescription, and then actually we can have an idea of actually what we're prescribing to either the athletes we coach or ourselves, and actually saying if we're applying this stimulus, then actually we can then see what responses are. And if we're just being a bit random with our training prescription and we're not really having any idea of what intensity we're working at, are we working above threshold, are we working below threshold, then actually we don't know what the stimulus we gave to reach the adaptations and the race performances that we've resulted with. But actually, if we're a bit more precise and we track what training we do in what, if it's below threshold, if it's above threshold, and we look at the results from that, then that means that actually in our next training block, we can see what perhaps worked well last time. Maybe we need to add in a bit more threshold work and see what that does to our race performances. Or maybe we actually want to add a bit more stuff above threshold, more closer to VO2 max intensities, and see how that affects our adaptations and our race performances. Otherwise, I feel like it's a bit of hit and miss, and we can't really evolve our training and refine our training over time. So I think that's justification in itself as to why we should actually why we should get some marker of where our second threshold is, and also why we should really be good at logging our training and tracking our training and observing how we respond to the stress that we've given our body in terms of the training that we've done. And I think actually there could be a whole podcast, which maybe would be a future episode, on actually, is threshold training an effective way to train or not? I'll give you my bias at the moment. I think it is an effective way to train, but I don't think it's the only way to train. And I don't think everyone should just be doing threshold training. And by threshold training, I mean training that is below the second threshold in that sort of in that heavy intensity domain. But I think there could be a whole podcast on just looking at how the Ingebrigtsens train, for example, and then saying actually why that might be an effective strategy. But before we go down that rabbit hole, I'm going to bring us to actually how can we measure the second threshold. Now, I've sort of alluded to this already. Like traditionally, it would be done in a lab, and actually what was always the gold standard would be to come into the lab with some estimate of where you think that second threshold is. And then on consecutive days, or not consecutive days, but on subsequent visits to the lab, you would come in and you'd do a 30-minute run or ride if you go on the bike at a fixed intensity, which you're estimating as probably slightly below your threshold, your second threshold, and you would measure lactate. And what you'd be looking for is a nice stable response. And the classical or the textbook definition is actually that the lactate at 10 minutes the lactate at 30 minutes, should only be 1 millimole or less than 1 millimole higher than the lactate at 10 minutes. So for example, lactate might be 2.5 millimole at 10 minutes, and 30 minutes it's 3 millimole. Okay, so it's gone up by less than 1 millimole, and so that we can say that you are probably below your maximal lactate steady state or your second threshold. Now, what you do then is come in on a subsequent day and run or ride at slightly higher intensity and see if you are still, if that relationship still held true. So maybe this time you come in and it starts at 3 millimole, you're at 10 minutes, and at 30 minutes is 3.5 millimole. Okay, great. Right, that seems to be also below your second threshold. Right, that means that we're confident that intensity is below your second threshold, and we're going to have to invite you back again to see if going up a bit more still produces a stable result. So this time you're riding your higher power output, you're running at slightly faster speeds, but this time you see that you're 4 millimole at 10 minutes and you're 5 millimole, 5.5 millimole at 30 minutes. So okay, that's probably above your maximal lactate steady state or your maximal metabolic steady state. Now, as you can imagine, that is quite laborious. It involves lots of visits to the lab. So in practical terms, this probably only really happens in a research capacity. You don't get elite athletes doing that. What you tend to happen is they come to the lab, they'll do a series of, they'll do an incremental exercise tests where they might do between 3 and 5 minute stages typically, where each stage will increase by 1 kilometer an hour. And you try to identify the point where lactate goes from increasing just slowly. So for example, subsequent stages might look like 2.5 millimole, 3.5 millimole, 4.5 millimole, and then the next one is 6 millimole. So there's a big jump after that. And that point there where lactate goes from rising slowly to rising quickly is labeled the lactate turn point, and that is an approximation of your maximal lactate steady state, your second threshold. So that's often what happens in a laboratory setting. There are other ways of doing it, but I'd say that's how I often do it, and it's a typical way of getting a good amount of data in an effective and efficient period of time. But actually there are ways we can do a similar thing outside of the lab. Okay, and that brings us to the concept of critical speeds. Now you may have heard of critical speeds. You may have heard of critical power, which is actually used in cycling, but it's the same concept and actually has been very highly adopted in cycling as the best way of determining the second threshold. But basically, the concept relies on the fact that we can hold a very fast speed for only a short period of time. So the 800 meters, for example, we're racing 800 meters, maybe we can sustain 22 kilometers an hour. Okay, but we can only do that for 2 minutes, ballpark figures. But as we increase the speeds, increase the duration of the competition we're competing at, the speed drops off quite quickly at first. Okay, so the difference between 800 meter speed and 1500 meter speed is quite a lot, but then it starts to level off. So actually, the difference between racing at 1500 meters and 3K, the speed obviously is slower, but it's not a massive drop in speed. And the speed difference between a 5K and a 10K is actually quite a small difference. And so we see this sort of exponential fall in our speed we can sustain over the different distances. And this goes back to the concept of this battery, which we can either use very quickly in the case of an 800 meters, or we can eke it out more slowly over the case of a 5K or a 10K. And the rate that we use that battery is actually not too much different between a 5K and a 10K, whereas actually at an 800 meters, it's very, very quick, really. We're depleting this battery. And this point where where this curve starts to level off is what is referred to as the critical speed, because actually we're now getting down to intensities that are sustainable for quite a long period of time, and this coincides really well with the second threshold. And that's because the fatigue mechanisms that are happening below the second threshold are much slower to manifest. Okay, it's much more sustainable speed. So it would make sense that actually as we get closer to, as competition distances and performances get closer to our critical speeds or our second threshold, then they're going to start dropping off at a reduced rate. And so that actually as we get closer to critical speeds, we're going to fatigue much less quickly. So critical speed is actually a concept that is quite hard to explain, at least for me, over an audio file, and actually it's much easier to see a picture of it, and then it becomes quite self-explanatory. But what I've done is I've created a calculator in Excel, which I'm going to share in the show notes with you. And what this will do is that you can plug in some race performances, which will then be used to calculate your critical speed. And it will also give you your W prime, which is in the critical speed model the equivalent of a battery that I've been talking about throughout this podcast, and the battery being the amount of work that you can do above W prime. So if you want to go and have a mess around with that calculator, there are a few rules out there. Within the calculator I've put instructions of how to use it, but basically what we need is we need at least 2 performances, either races or time trials. You want them to be recent, so they actually reflect your current physiology. There's no point taking PBs from 5 years ago, because that's not going to reflect your current physiological state. And it's also important that these performances are in the 2-minute to about 30-minute window, okay? Because what these performances need to do is they need to be above your second threshold, or confidently above your second threshold, and you need to completely deplete your W prime or your battery, or the work that you can do above your threshold during these performances. And that's very important, otherwise it's going to miscalculate where your critical speed is. And you also don't want it to be too short. So for example, if you've run the 800 meters in 1 minute 50, 1 minute 40, if you're super, super good, then that's probably not going to be long enough to necessarily get all the way up to VO2 max and deplete your battery within that window. So I've put the event distances you can put in from 1,000 meters up to 10K. I would only use the 10K one if you can run the 10K in under 30 minutes. Realistically, for most people, you're going to get a better estimate of your critical speed if you're using the 5K down to the 1K distances. Now, some practical recommendations and how do we apply the critical speed model? I mean, as I said in the introduction, one of the reasons why I've decided to focus on critical speed and the second threshold within this podcast is A, it seems to be important for performance, but B, critical speed allows anybody to go and calculate their second threshold in a very accurate way, especially if you've been very controlled in your performance data that you're using, that you're putting into the model. So, for example, in a lab setting, it's been shown to be very reliable, but you also need to make sure that the quality of the data that you're giving the model is really good. So, for example, if you're using a 5K time from a hilly course which had a bit of off-road in it, and you're using a 3K time that you've got from a track race, then those two performances aren't really equivocal. So you want to have performance data, whether that be a time trial or a race, which are from similar settings. So either both from a road or both from a track, probably with a good, similar environmental conditions. And obviously you want to be well rested going into both of those performances and be sufficiently motivated to really get a full effort out of yourself. And I'd also recommend that actually if you've got 3 recent performances compared to only having 2, then that is going to increase the confidence that you can have in the critical speed that is generated from the calculator. Because that's going to, if there's a little bit of variability, if one of them, maybe one of those performances you weren't quite as motivated for, you don't think actually maybe you were as fresh and tapered for, then actually it's not going to have as big a influence on the result, because it's going to be diluted out because you've got 3 performance conditions instead of just the 2. So the more high quality data you can feed it, the better the model is going to be, the more accurate and more confidence you can have in the critical speed that it generates. Now, in practical terms, say you've got a critical speed that you've put good data into a model, you're very confident that the critical speed represents your physiology. You've been to the lab and it seems to match up reasonably well with what your lactate turn point was, for example. Now, when you're doing a threshold session, you want to probably be below your critical speed, because actually if you are only slightly above your critical speed, then you're going to start depleting that battery and you're going to start fatiguing at a much quicker rate than if you were below it. And you probably want to be a bit below it, okay? So maybe like 10 seconds a mile, because actually as soon as you start exceeding your critical speed, then you're going to start depleting that battery and you're going to fatigue much more quickly. And actually there's going to be some drift over the course of an interval session as it is. Okay, so if let's say we're doing 6 by a mile, actually by the end of the session, you're going to start fatiguing anyway. You might become slightly less economical. And so actually if you maintain the same speed, you're going to your heart rate is going to be higher even for the same speed, and you're going to start drifting into or above your second threshold intensity, okay, even if the actual pace is the same. So I would give yourself a bit of a buffer. Like we've already said already that training at the second threshold, exactly at it, is not important. And I'll be more concerned with getting a consistent response in your training. And it'd also be worth observing actually when you're doing sessions that are below your critical speed, actually, are you seeing a pretty stable heart rate? Is RPE staying pretty stable? And if it is, then that's fantastic. That's a confirmation that yes, you are at your threshold pace. You're below your second threshold in that space that's between your lactate threshold and your second threshold, your first threshold and your second threshold, and that actually you're correctly executing the session. But on the other hand, if you are seeing that actually you're finding it's very, very difficult, heart rate is drifting up all the time from one rep interval to the next, or over the course of a continuous tempo run, but actually heart rate is going up by 20 beats over the course of the 30-minute tempo run, then that's probably a sign that you've overestimated your critical speed, and maybe you need to dial it back a bit. And I think, although there are many plus sides to critical speed, one of the disadvantages are that it doesn't account for in real time the environment or fatigue, for example. So, for example, if we've got heart rate data derived from a test in the lab, then if we stick to the heart rate, that is going to take into account if it's very hot. So if it's very hot, your heart rate is going to be higher, and so that you're going to have to run at a slower intensity. But if you keep to the heart rate zones, then you're probably still going to be within the intended intensity domain that you set out to be in. Whereas if you've got a critical speed that's been established from some races that have been in ideal weather conditions, and you were fresh, and everything was perfect on race day, you felt amazing, but now you've got to a club night and you're a bit tired, it's blowing a gale, it's 30 degrees, then actually those speeds derived from the critical speed tests are not going to reflect your current critical speed in those current conditions. And in that way, actually, you need to be able to use either just your subjective RPE, your rate of perceived exertion, or use some other marker such as heart rate, or if you've got it, measuring lactate directly to ensure that you're running at the correct intensity. But I think for those people who don't have access to lactate, it's a really useful tool, and actually it's going to give you a much better idea of where your second threshold lies, rather than using your 1 hour pace or your half marathon pace, for example. Okay, and it's something that you can track over time, and it's really it's going to be good enough for the vast majority of people for determining where your second threshold is. So that is critical speed, the critical speed model. I'm just going to summarize what we've talked about in this podcast. So what is the second threshold? The second threshold, it's got many names, including the lactate turn point, the maximal lactate steady state, critical speed, but all of these markers, these different measures, are trying to estimate the highest intensity that you can maintain whilst still having a metabolic steady state. And so that actually, if you're exercising below this intensity, then heart rate, lactate, RPE are going to stay elevated but fairly stable over time. Whereas if you exceed this threshold, then all of these things, lactate, oxygen consumption, heart rate, are just going to drift up until they reach maximum. So you get to VO2 max, until you get to heart rate max, until your RPE is 10 out of 10. The second threshold seems to be really important for performance. For events such as a marathon that happen below the second threshold, the second threshold acts as the ceiling of what is sustainable. And so that actually you need to be able to be below that second threshold if you want to maintain an exercise intensity for a long period of time. But the second threshold also seems to be important when you're competing in events that are faster than the second threshold, such as the 1500 meters, the 5K, 10K. And that's because if you've got a higher second threshold, a higher critical speed, a higher maximal lactate steady state, then more of your energy you're getting is coming from sustainable sources. And that's going to decrease your reliance upon glycolysis, anaerobic metabolism, and mean that battery, that W prime, is available either to allow you to run faster over the course of the whole race, or to allow you to have a big finishing kick at the end. The determinants of the second threshold aren't exactly, I don't think there's a consensus, certainly not a consensus on what is going on within the body that's determining our second threshold. But two things that seem to be really important are the amount of slow twitch fibers we have, which slow twitch fibers have a very big aerobic capacity to do work. So actually, what are the muscle fibers' aerobic capacity to do work? How much slow twitch fibers do we have? And the second important point is how is the degree of capillarization. So how well are these slow twitch fibers perfused with blood and able to extract oxygen and glucose and get rid of CO2 and lactate. How should we train to improve our second threshold? Well, we're looking to improve the aerobic capacity of our muscle fibers, both our slow twitch and probably our fast twitch too. And we want to increase the rate of angiogenesis we've had, so increase the capillarization of our muscle fibers. The latter of this is probably going to come from doing high volume of low intensity training. But we're probably going to need a mix of both high volume, low intensity training and high intensity training. I expect both above and below the second threshold to help improve the aerobic capacities of our muscle fibers. There are lots of different ways we can measure the second threshold. In the lab and the setting, it tends to be using lactate, but a really good way of measuring it in the field is using the critical speed concept and the critical speed model, which you can get from just looking at time trial and race performances in the 2 to 30 minute window. And I've linked the calculators for that in the show notes. There are flaws to critical speeds, in that it doesn't account for environmental changes or your fatigue status compared to using heart rate, but it's still a good enough tool for most people. And I think that's about wrapped up the summary of the show. Now, I really hope that I haven't made this potentially very confusing topic even more confusing, and I haven't just butchered critical speeds and critical power, because it does get, as I said, it gets very confusing very quickly, and some of these things are much easier to see visually rather than describe over a podcast. The only thing left for me to do is recommend some people for you to follow. And I've got 2 really good recommendations today. The first is Dr. Mark Burnley. So he can be found on Twitter, but he's also got some fantastic episodes on YouTube. And his channel is called All Out Physiology. But I will link to that in the show notes. And the second person I would recommend you go and follow is Dr. Phil Schieber. I'm not quite sure how you pronounce his name, but again, he's been on lots of podcasts, as is Mark Burnley, but he is I'd say he's an expert in critical speed and critical power modeling, and he's got a book that specifically focuses on that, really, called Scientific Training for Endurance Athletes. So both of those 2 are well worth looking up and probably do a much better job than me of explaining some of these concepts. I hope you found it interesting. Again, feedback, and it will be really useful for me. And if you've got any podcast ideas for subsequent episodes, please do send them my way. You can follow me on Twitter. You can subscribe now to the podcast on Spotify and on Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts. So go check them out there if that's or wherever you want to listen to this podcast. It's available in most major streaming services now. So yeah, I hope everyone has a good week of training, and hopefully catch you again soon.